Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to another Eye on Africa. Happy New Year. And for those who don't know me, I am Awasad, the Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center. So I'm very excited today to have here John Aerni-Flessner. So John is gonna, I think there is a little bit of change in the title. A little bit.
I put a shorter title here because it wasn't fitting. So
good. Yeah. So here we have boundaries in the borderlands.
The dates have changed slightly.
The dates, okay, yes. Yeah. So, but the main points I'm sure are going to be there. So, John is gonna talk today about boundaries in the borderlands, border dispute, 1920s, 1976. And before we start, I'm just gonna tell you a little bit about the speaker. So before going back to earn an African history PhD from Washington University in St. Louis, Associate Professor John Aerni-Flessner taught high school in Lesotho, Southern Africa, and I'm just gonna say,
in a small village in Alaska.
In a small village in Alaska. He has taught for 6 years at the Residential College in the Arts and Humanities at MSU. His research has focused on nationalism, development, and decolonization in Lesotho. His first book, Dreams for Lesotho, Independence, Foreign Assistance, and Development, told the story of how the ideas of development and independence became intertwined in official discourse in early independence Lesotho, but also how the ideas help ordinary people maintain faith in the idea of the nation, even when they face daily struggles to survive in the shadow of the apartheid regime. Dr. Aerni-Flessner's work on development has also appeared in the Journal of African History, the International Journal of African Historical Studies, and Ouagadougou, a journal of transnational women's and gender studies. His current project will tell the story of the Lesotho-South Africa border from the 19th century to the present. A preliminary article on this has appeared in the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History. So everybody, a warm welcome to John.
Thank you all for coming out today, and thank you to the web audience. It's good to see you, even if we have no idea who you are. So thanks for that introduction, Awa. I'm just going to jump right in here to the paper that I want to give today. It's, as Awa noted, part of early stages of a long project to try to tell the history of the Lesotho-South Africa border in all of its complexity, being the only major country completely surrounded by one other country with no outlets to the sea. It makes the border an especially compelling one to tell the story of. As I talk today, I will be referring to the territory for most of the time as Lesotho because that's how its inhabitants and residents know it. I will occasionally refer to colonial Basotho land, but I try not to. And the people who live in Lesotho, are Basotho, singular is Masutu. So when I'm referring to the Basotho, I'm talking about the people of the land of Lesotho. So, boundaries in the borderlands, unbuilt dams and boundary disputes between Lesotho and South Africa, 1920s to 1976. In February 1976, the on-again, off-again talks between Lesotho and South Africa over the construction of dams on Lesotho's rivers to supply South Africa with Lesotho's abundant water resurfaced. The formal talks, which were at that point almost 10 years old, seemed to have reached a breakthrough after a series of setbacks in the early 1970s, after Lesotho changed tack on its foreign affairs and relations with the apartheid regime. By 1976, however, both parties were eager to re-engage. The government of Lesotho needed the money that a water agreement would bring to promote economic development, while South Africa increasingly needed new water supplies to enable economic growth to continue on the Witwatersrand and in the Free State goldfield towns that were booming. The talks were scheduled for May 10th, 1976, but had to be rescheduled at the last minute. Thus, on the 17th of June, 1976, South African Water Affairs Minister Bram Raubenheimer arrived in Maseru in anticipation of the talks that were scheduled to begin the next day. These talks never happened because of the global reaction to the events that started on 16 June, 1976, the Soweto Uprising. With global condemnation of Soweto rising, the Lesotho government refused to meet with Minister Raubenheimer, who was already in country, and the process was once again delayed. While the talks would stretch on for another decade before culminating in the Lesotho Highlands Water Project deal in 1986, it is important to examine the series of failed negotiations that range from the 1940s to the 1970s, because they highlight how citizen pressures indirectly helped shape the project. From big projects like dams, these years also saw numerous discussions and disputes over tiny pieces of territory that were contested on the border of Lesotho and South Africa. With one of the most rugged mountain borders in the world, this is perhaps not surprising, but the reactions of the various state actors to questions of ownership and value are. The water project proposals and conversations over slices of territory and access to border resources suggest that the borders of the state were certainly not on the periphery of the national imagination in either Lesotho or South Africa. Rather, they were front and center in the ways that ordinary people and politicians conceived of the nation and of the idea of sovereignty. The borders of Lesotho were set in the 1860s with the last round of negotiations between Moshoeshoe, the Orange Free State, and the British government. However, the boundaries as set down on paper never mapped particularly well to the realities on the ground, and certainly not in the imaginations of Basotho, who still today call for the return of the conquered territories in South Africa, which encompass various swaths of today's provinces of the Free State, Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal, and the Eastern Cape, depending on who you ask. The inability of South African officials to convince Basotho that the Caledon River, Mohokare in Sesotho, and the mountain boundaries were the rightful borders of Lesotho served as the backdrop to a series of negotiations around the border that took place throughout the 20th century. Water was the impetus for many of these talks, but the idea of Lesotho being able to successfully make the case for expanded borders scuttled water plans and complicated discussions about land use, tourism, and grazing rights. It is through water projects and negotiations about far-flung mountain borders that we can see the different considerations that government planners had to take into account when talking about water, cooperation, and the border. On one hand, the discussions were arcanely geographic at times. How to determine the center line of a river, or what was the difference between a watershed and a cliff line in remote mountains. On the other hand, these academic, geographical, bureaucratic, and technocratic questions also got to the heart of what was possible in terms of extending or negotiating over the physical borders of Lesotho. Discussions around the border, primarily among state actors, served as a proxy for larger disputes about the relationship between the two countries, because even when there was no one in the room calling for the return of Lesotho's conquered territories, as seen on the map here, this call helped shape the debate and gave Lesotho politicians leverage against their bigger, more economically dominant neighbor. In the mid-1920s, so this is a section on the Upper Tugela location here in the Herschel district. In the mid-1920s, the South African government became interested in formalizing the border between colonial Basotho land and South Africa, especially on the boundaries of the Cape Province and Natal, as these were largely not demarcated. They proposed a border commission in 1927 that would survey and place beacons on the border, especially in the most rugged and most unpopulated high mountain areas between Natal and Lesotho, some of which you see here. The colonial government in Lesotho never agreed to a full boundary commission, but two places in particular came under discussion around this time at opposite ends of Lesotho. In both the Kwakwa-Vitsishoek area in the northeast, pictured here, and the Herschel district along Lesotho's southwestern border with the Transkei, the boundaries were particularly ill-defined, as both of these areas were what were in South Africa known as native reserves or native locations, later to be the apartheid-era homelands. In the Vitsishoek area, or the Upper Tugela location as it was called in the records, the border in dispute was high in the mountains overlooking what would become the apartheid-era homeland capital of Pudati Jaba. When the British formally took over Basotho land in 1871 by annexing it to the Cape Colony, the border in the mountains was vaguely defined since the interior mountains of Lesotho were yet unsurveyed and sparsely populated. Thus, the Annexation Act of 1871 simply said that the border followed westward from Mount Al Source, quote, along the Drakensberg between the watersheds of the Orange River and the St. Johns River to the source of the Tees, end quote. This single short sentence was meant to define a mountainous border mostly situated above 10,000 feet in altitude that stretched for roughly 300 miles, and saying that the boundary was simply a watershed. Needless to say, this definition was found to be lacking in specificity in many places. One big issue was that it left many small patches of land above the krantz, which is a little hard to see here with the light, but you're looking at a cliff edge here. So yeah, that's great, thank you. So a krantz in Afrikaans is the top of the rocky cliff line that you can see in these pictures, but below the watershed boundary. Often this land was technically part of South Africa, but inaccessible from the rest of South Africa because of these unscalable cliffs. As you might guess, the small piece of South African land at the top here was not highly prized. The land pictured here was the land under discussion in the 1920s, as it was situated on the downward slope of Mount Al Sources, the source mountain for 4 major regional rivers, the Caledon, the Tugela, the Namahadi, which is part of the Orange River system, and the Khubedu or Elands River, which flows into the Vaal. And it also, you can sort of see here, contains a small watercourse here that becomes Tugela Falls, one of the highest single drop waterfalls in all of Africa. This is situated at the top of that. A letter from the British resident High Commissioner in February 1926 noted that, quote, the boundary at present recognized by farmers in Natal and the Basotho is the line of cliffs, inaccessible except at certain passes, end quote, but before any permanent beacons are erected marking the border there should be, quote, an inspection of the line and report on the present conditions carried out by colonial officials with a representative of the paramount chief of Lesotho along as well. Thus, the border had still not been formally surveyed and marked in 1926, 55 years after Lesotho became a colony. This joint informal inspection eventually took place because of the correspondence, and it actually led to a very surprising preliminary decision from South African officials. The South African Secretary for Lands proposed ceding 4,000 acres on this plateau to Lesotho. Writing in January 1927, he solicited advice internally among government departments asking if he should approve, quote, adopting the line of krantzes near the watershed, wherever that may be, thus depriving the location of some land, since the boundary on the Upper Tugela location was, quote, only approximate, end quote. And he included this beautiful hand-drawn map of the scene you were just looking at there. He asked the Secretary for Native Affairs if this was reasonable, noting that, quote, this was the only point where land has been alienated right up to the border. The Secretary for Lands saw this inaccessible slice of land as an administrative hassle and was thus advocating its relinquishment in the interests of simpler administration. However, the Secretary for Native Affairs and the Chief Native Commissioner for the Upper Tugela location both objected to this transfer of land to Lesotho. Not surprisingly, for most South African officials of the 1920s, they did not advocate for retaining the land out of a sense of obligation to protect land for the African residents of the Upper Tugela location. Rather, they noted that the land had possible future value for conservation and tourism. The Chief Native Commissioner voiced objections to the transfer since about 1,000 of the 4,000 acres were, quote, assets in the National Park Scheme, end quote. The land on the high plateau actually contained the provincial boundary as well between Natal and the Orange Free State, and the Natal side of the line was part of the Royal Natal National Park. The Secretary for Native Affairs seconded this value in the land, noting that, quote, there are no natives upon the plateau, so the location would lose nothing in the nature of occupational values, end quote. The explicit rationale for keeping the land, however, was a proposal that South African Railways had put forth the year before in 1926 to begin, quote, development of the Drakensberg for tourist traffic, with Mount Al Sources as one of its key features. They wanted to build shelters upon the plateau, a plan that would likely have no future if South African rights were handed over to a, quote, alien government, end quote. The tourism plan came to fruition, and today the Sentinel Peak hike, including a series of metal ladders affixed to the cliffs and a stone hut on the plateau, allows stunning views of Tugela Falls from above and Pudat Dijaba down below, though it's a bit hairy to climb the ladders, I can attest. All of this was still just in the planning stage in the 1920s, but it is instructive that the presence of the potential for white tourism trumped administrative expediency or considerations of African use for the land. On the southwestern side of Lesotho, along the border with the Transkei, there were far more people living in close proximity to the border, even if the terrain was also quite rugged. The border in the Herschel district area had long been a bone of contention, as accusations of stock theft, access to water, and people crossing the border illicitly to access better grazing were common. While the mountains were rugged, they were not steep like near Vitsie's and the Tele River was quite shallow most of the year, as you can see in this picture. That's the border down there at the bottom. In its upper reaches, the source of the river was contested. Thus, a group of officials, I skipped a little bit. In 1909, administrators from both the Cape and Basotho land met with representatives of the Basotho chieftaincy also present in an attempt to demarcate the border along the Tele River. In its upper reaches, the sources of the river was contested. Thus, this group demarcated a sponge, what we know as a wetland, high above what today is the Tiffendel ski resort as the ultimate source of the river, leading to a decade and a half of agreement on this section of the border. In the 1920s, however, disputes arose along the lower river about access to the water and floodplain fields. Basotho land officials had received a complaint in early 1924 about a local Basotho headman named Chief Tswane confiscating cattle that Herschel district residents from South Africa were attempting to water in the river. As noted in the June 24th report from the Assistant Commissioner in Gaborone, the border was defined according to the 1871 treaty, so that when the river had jumped its banks and carved out a new main channel in 1896, the border remained at the now dry 1871 main channel. Dry channel, yes. This left a slice of Lesotho's territory on the opposite side of the river. Thus, Herschel district representatives and residents who wanted access to water needed to cross the old riverbed and fields that were legally now within the boundaries of Lesotho. Authorities on both sides of the border in 1924 thought this was a relatively easy case to, quote, settle once and for all about where the border was and who had access to land that did not necessarily follow the current watercourse. This turned out to be not the case. Meetings on this particular topic dragged on into 1925 because the Herschel district residents did not want to have only one legal demarcated path to the river. They wanted to be able to drive their cattle and other small stock to the water anywhere along the watercourse. Meanwhile, chiefs and representatives of communities on the Lesotho side also balked at the proposal to erect one path via a series of beacons or boundary markers because of a general, quote, suspicion over the question of beacons, end quote. These individuals worried that erecting beacons would formalize a change in sovereignty over the land that they claimed, but that now also happened to lie on the opposite side of the river. They were unwilling to cede territories to individuals or groups on the South African side, even if everyone here along this river is Sesotho speaking and considers themselves to be Basotho. Thus, as with the Vitsie's case, while there was an impetus among some colonial administrators to just settle boundary disputes quickly, doing so was a difficult proposition because other constituencies, African groups and bureaucratic interests in both countries, rejected the proposed settlements. Marking and demarcating the border was controversial in both Lesotho and South Africa because it involved a finality that all understood. The flexibility of an undemarcated border was prized by people living along it and even by some administrators. I want to now turn to some of the water projects. So while disputes over the boundaries between the native reserves and Lesotho were important to the local communities and to officials of various departments, the disputes affected a relatively few people and did not attract much attention. Water, the damming of rivers, and what South Africans call interbasin transfer, moving water from one river system to a different one, potentially affected many more people and were significantly more visible. While the Highlands dams of the 1990s and 2000s flooded the land of a relatively few people, the first proposals put forth for the construction of dams in Lesotho in the early 20th century would have actually displaced far more people. The South African government proposed a number of large interbasin transfer schemes in the mid-20th century in an attempt to relieve chronic water shortages in the dry country. Most of these were focused on the Orange River system. One of the largest of these was the building of the Hendrik Verwoerd Dam, now renamed in the post-apartheid era the Gariep Dam in the Free State west of Lesotho, that included an 83-kilometer-long transfer tunnel to move water from the Orange River to the Eastern Cape. However, this transfer scheme, which was not operational until 1971, did not solve the problem of water scarcity across the arid Free State, and in particular the water shortages faced by Bloemfontein, the provincial capital, the Free State goldfields, or white farmers clamoring for more water for irrigation. One of the first proposals for interbasin transfer from Lesotho's rivers to South Africa came about because of the discovery of the Free State goldfields in the 1930s. While I've only found some limited archival records so far, it appears that Prime Minister Jan Smuts and other South African officials put forward a secret proposal to tap the waters of Lesotho as early as the 1940s. While the 1938 completed Vaal Dam in South Africa initially could supply water for the goldfields, it was clear that more water would eventually be needed, and the closest source was Lesotho and the muddy Caledon River. Prime Minister Smuts wrote to the British High Commissioner in Pretoria in December 1942 about plans to dam the Caledon River to supply the goldfields, noting that the project was still in its, quote, investigational stage, and that the, quote, informal negotiations have been of a preliminary nature only, with a view to arriving at an appreciation of the difficulties likely to be encountered in the submergence of territory beyond the confines of the Union. Thinly veiled through this, Smuts is referring to the outrage that a plan to dam the Caledon would engender in Lesotho if this plan were made public. Any dam on the Caledon would necessitate the uprooting of many Basotho farms from their fertile lowland homes. So while he makes no explicit reference to the conquered territory debate, we clearly see that Smuts understood the strongly emotive responses that even proposing this, much less making it happen, would surely engender among Basotho who had resisted incorporation into South Africa from before it was even a country. Inundating Lesotho's land was akin to taking it in order to benefit South African mines, cities, and farms. It is possible that the British High Commissioner never even communicated this correspondence back to Lesotho, or most likely kept it only for the eyes of top British officials like the resident commissioner. By 1944, however, this project proposal seems to have reached the end of its particular lifetime. A July 1944 letter from the Director of Irrigation in South Africa reported that the Caledon explorations had been, quote, very disappointing, and the scheme to utilize the river for irrigation in South Africa should, quote, be abandoned in favor of dams further down on the Orange River where the reservoirs would be entirely within South Africa. Yet the idea of utilizing Lesotho's water for South African purposes through Caledon dams certainly did not die. South African plans for Free State water utilization in 1946-47 still have 3 dams planned for the Upper Caledon River to the north and west of Maseru. Further, the various iterations of the plans for the never-built Oxbow project, the precursor to the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, from the 1950s to 1975, all contained dams on the Caledon. The Oxbow project was smaller in scale to the Highlands project that was eventually built, but its focus on the Caledon is extremely important here. Later I'll add details to the Oxbow negotiations, but for now it's instructive to think of what the presence of the Caledon in water projects as early as the 1940s and 1950s tells us. All of the projects involved storage dams on the Caledon that would then be channeled to other dams in the Free State across the Caledon Vaal watershed. Supplying South African cities like Bloemfontein, mines in the Free State, and white-owned farms, they would all be channeling Lesotho's water primarily for the benefit of the European descendant minority in South Africa. In addition to the inundation of the land, this too made the water projects hugely controversial in Lesotho. Thus, plans for Caledon dams were largely kept secret, and they were not widely known among Basotho chiefs, National Council representatives, or among the population writ large. This need for secrecy reflects the deeply held mistrust Basotho had toward both South African officials and British administrators, and what Basotho perceived as their underhanded and secretive plans for Lesotho's land. Common in political discourse during these decades was the idea that British colonial officials were simply biding time until they could hand over Lesotho to the Union and obfuscating about their true intentions. This lack of transparency about the major dam plans and the fact that they were never announced despite being in the plans for 25 years gives some credence to Basotho's suspicions. British administrators were potentially willing to inundate some of Lesotho's land and water and sell water for cash if the price was right to South Africa. The secrecy around the plans also suggests that both South African and British colonial officials understood the potentially explosive nature of border issues, especially with the rise of nationalist political sentiment in the 1950s and 1960s in Lesotho. Additionally, it was not just the land within Lesotho's borders that would have inflamed chiefs, politicians, and ordinary Basotho. As part of the conquered territory that the Basotho Land Congress Party had made a centerpiece of their nationalist campaign for independence, the land on the other side of the Mohokari Caledon was viewed by many Basotho as being part of the territory that rightfully belonged to an independent Lesotho. So while I have this labeled Republic of South Africa on the left and Lesotho on the right, many Basotho would claim you're looking at Lesotho on both sides of that river. So the nationalist push for independence in Lesotho centered the return of the conquered territories as a key theme and primary goal. Thus, flooding the conquered territories and forever claiming it for South Africa would have been seen as foreclosing on the ability of Basotho to ever demand this land be returned, and would have caused an almost equal amount of concern amongst residents in Lesotho. The South African authorities, too, clearly understood the emotive meanings of the conquered territories and had to take that into account in their planning. A Prime Minister's Office memo from 1964 about river boundaries conspicuously points out that future plans for water projects along the Caledon would, of necessity, entail inundating lots of land. Similarly, cabinet-level discussions on the water project in the mid-1960s saw many ministers expressing their views that they wanted access to Lesotho's water, but worried about the cost and constraints they could then no longer control since Lesotho was moving toward independence. In all of these high-level meetings, while apartheid ministers never entertained the idea of returning land to Lesotho, the pressure campaign by Lesotho politicians and ordinary Basotho to keep the idea of land return alive was in fact constraining in some ways the options available to South African leaders as they attempted to plan for the future of water use in the Republic. So in the early 1950s, it was into this environment of mistrust, suspicion, and constraint. Basotho distrusted the colonial rulers. South African politicians refused to acknowledge Basotho calls for land, but were constrained by them anyway. And where the British rulers were under global pressure to, quote-unquote, develop their poor landlocked colony they had previously only seen as a labor reserve, the proposals for the Oxbow project came into being. This plan entailed building a large dammed reservoir 8,000 feet up in the Lesotho Mountains, building a tunnel under the mountains to both sell water to South Africa and to generate electricity en route that could be used locally and sold to the Republic. The key for the success of the scheme, however, lay in the 3 storage dams that would be built along the Caledon River, each with its own pipeline or tunnel across the watershed to the Vaal River system and various points in the Free State. None of the announcements in Lesotho by British officials who were driving the project forward included any mention of the Caledon dams. As early as 1951, the visiting British Secretary of State for Commonwealth Relations noted that plans for the water project in Lesotho had already been, quote, carefully explored and checked, end quote, though the project was, quote, still confidential, and he couldn't divulge any details to local representatives. British officials answered questions on the project at the National Council in 1954, saying, we held pizzos or meetings all over the country, but right now they are still investigating possibilities. There is no report yet. Similarly, at the opening of the October 1956 session of the National Council, the High Commissioner reported on the project's Highland dams, the proposed hydroelectric station, and a grant from the UK government to fund further studies, but made no mention of how the Caledon would need to be utilized. And further, in May 1957, the National Council again discussed the issue, but there was nary a word about the Caledon. Thus, Basotho chiefs and representatives focused their criticism of the project on 2 points. 1, how the water was going to be used in South Africa instead of being channeled to Basotho to relieve residents of chronic water shortages, and 2, how much land mountain residents might have to sacrifice to the interests of the scheme. A 1965 note stuck in the South African government files from former British Deputy High Commissioner Latimer suggests again that this silence on the Caledon was deliberate. Writing about South Africa's attempts to formally demarcate the boundary between Lesotho and Natal, Latimer suggests that open discussions of this border would give, quote, prominence to the issue of the border more generally and, quote, provoke tribal agitation, end quote. Overlooking the condescending phrase tribal agitation, Latimer is noting that the border and any political issue around the conquered territories was still a prime driver of public sentiment and political agitation around independence in Lesotho. So the publicly announced plans for the Oxbow project, almost 15 years after preliminary engineering and technical surveys had started, were still concealing the fact that building Caledon River dams would be required for this project. This again testifies to the power that the public calls for the return of the conquered territories had. The inundation of lowland land in Lesotho would have been controversial, but so would have firmly marking the Caledon as the boundary between the countries, since again it foreclosed the possibility of land return, an outcome the skeptical Basotho populace had long feared the British colonial government and apartheid regime were secretly collaborating on, and here in 1965 we are on the cusp of independence, and the fear is that it will happen here and now in the last gasp. Perhaps surprising at first glance, then, is the consistency in terms of secrecy from the Lesotho government as the Basotho National Party took over the reins of power on the eve of independence. Still, perhaps not surprisingly, Prime Minister Leabua Jonathan and the Basotho National Party saw the promise of immense benefits from the Oxbow water plan as well. The BNP badly needed development support from the apartheid regime, while Pretoria not only wanted independent Lesotho's water, but with the coming of independence, they could gain political cachet through the project as well. The Oxbow project could be a shining example of the apartheid government having good relations with an independent African government, something they were hard-pressed to come by in most of the continent. So despite reservations within both governments on some levels, talks were actually progressing nicely in 1966 and 1967 after Lesotho's independence. This was a boon to Lesotho Prime Minister Leabua Jonathan, who had come to power promising development would follow his election and independence. However, his pronouncements about the plans for the water project were as vague as colonial-era announcements had been. The plans in the files still all show dams on the Caledon in the period from 1966 to 1968. This in particular, this one is from 1967, and you can see the dams are marked in the boxes along the Purple River, cutting diagonally through on the border of Lesotho there, if you can't read the map from where you are. This was not, however, a case of South Africa hiding an inconvenient truth from Lesotho officials. Two top aides to Prime Minister Leabua Jonathan, Ndate Mapatwana and Dr. Beemans, were at a meeting in October 1968 where with South African officials they all schemed on strategies for how to sell a skeptical Basotho public on the idea of inundating lowlands Lesotho. The talking points proposed by the Lesotho advisors were to focus first on emphasizing an enhanced water supply to the capital Maseru, then on the irrigation of land in Lesotho, and finally, quote, the supply of water to South Africa, end quote. Of course, the Basotho public, and in particular the political opposition, were not going to be fooled or mollified into overlooking what to them would be an outrageous aspect of the project by hiding it in third position. Needless to say, this announcement was never made. Talks proceeded apace on the Oxbow scheme into the early 1970s. They broke down a few times, ostensibly around the issue of the price for water and who could turn the spigot on and off. However, the real issue was the changing dynamics of the diplomatic relationship between Lesotho and South Africa. As Lesotho moved to break with South Africa in 1971 and 1972, the water talks became more contentious and eventually broke down entirely in November of 1972. Yet they still remained an important goal for both governments, so they returned to them again and again. In 1972, Lesotho tried to get the United States to fund a smaller water project in the mountains aimed at domestic consumption, but USAID rejected this proposal. This led to a resumption of talks in 1974 with South Africa. The same plans for Oxbow were back on the table, as was at least one of the Caledon dams, the Rondebourg Dam upstream from Maseru. However, 1974 would prove to be the end of plans to dam the Caledon. In 1975, the government of Lesotho finally acknowledged the reality. Any scheme that inundated lowlands Lesotho was politically untenable. Their final written objections took two different forms. The first was a purely cost issue in that dams that involved resettlement of densely populated lowland villages were just too costly. The other, however, speaks to the continued invisible but important role that Basotho pressure for the return of the conquered territories had played in this whole saga. The Lesotho government could not countenance Caledon dams in the plans because, quote, once built, the Caledon River would forever be the boundary between Lesotho and the Orange Free State, end quote, thus foreclosing territorial return. The end of the Caledon dams marks the end of the Oxbow project and thus of large dams being built directly on the river borders. But it was certainly not the end of talks about dams in Lesotho. The foreclosure of the possibility of building border dams meant that the projects in the mountains had to increase in size for the project to make economic sense. That the governments continued the talks on water speaks to how much each side needed the project despite the increasingly poor relations between them in most areas of concern from 1975 onward. The Lesotho government became increasingly militant about the issue of the conquered territories in some of these meetings. In February of 1976, for instance, Lesotho's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sidi Malapo, was in Pretoria to discuss South Africa's idea of a joint boundary commission to finally demarcate those mountain boundaries, the idea they had started talking about in the 1920s. This meeting, as every other one prior to this in the last 50 years had, went nowhere, as South Africa wanted to discuss only the mountain boundaries, while Lesotho wanted to talk about the Free State boundary as well, code for the return of the conquered territories. The South African files record Malapo as stating that a boundary commission to only look at the mountains was untenable. Quote, if Lesotho accepted the terms of reference for the boundary commission in respect of only two areas excluding the Free State part, they would then be tacitly accepting the present boundary. It had to be realized that trouble would then erupt from time to time on land which Lesotho considered theirs, end quote. The South African Minister of Foreign Affairs, Hilgard Muller, simply responded that South African territory was, quote, not negotiable. Thus, in 1976, making the explicit case for the return of the conquered territories a starting point for the conversation meant that Lesotho officials were utilizing the strong public sentiment to push back against South African efforts to dominate and shape border talks and the water project. It was not a lot of leverage, and as a negotiating tactic, it stood little chance of success at actually expanding the borders of Lesotho, but leverage it was. Thank you. I have some thank yous up here as well, but yeah, so.
Thank you very much, John. That was very interesting. Any questions, comments?
I thought it was a very interesting story, but I felt like you stopped 45 years ago. So I'm curious to know kind of what's happened since then a little bit.
Yeah, what's happened since then is a whole imbroglio as well. So the discussions continued for another 10 years after 1976, and they were looking like they would break through at times and failing at others. The issue was resolved by South Africa sponsoring a military coup in 1976 to get rid of the Jonathan government, and then that government that had been put in place with South African assistance turning around and signing the water treaty. So there's still a lot of criticism of the water treaty in Lesotho because of how it was generated through two non-representative governments signing an accord. The Phase 1A and 1B have been built. There's two large dams and a series of tunnels underneath that supply something like 40% of the Johannesburg area's water today. And a third dam is they're in the process of upgrading roads as we speak, and the Polihali Dam is supposed to come online a few years down the road here. So the water projects continue. There's talk of, the initial plans had 5 dams in the highlands. This will be the third. We'll see where it goes from here. But it's a major source of revenue for the Lesotho government and a major source of controversy within the country because, again, the water is being taken and delivered straight to South Africa without any domestic use or consumption of that in a country that suffers frequently from drought. So it's immensely complicated, and the sort of second aim of this is to write a prehistory of that so that this longer history and the negotiations can be told. So. Yeah, Jamie. We'll wait for the microphone to pass around so our web audience can hear all the questions as well.
Yeah, thank you, John. This is so interesting, and yeah, congratulations for taking up this topic. When I teach my South Africa class, we do a whole Google Earth learning experience about this border history, and
Awesome.
so I've always been waiting for someone to give us something better to read.
Oh, no pressure. Thanks. Thanks, Jamie.
Or something.
Finish
to
it
read.
quickly.
There's nothing. But one of the things that strikes me is that, as an environmental historian, is that land isn't a neutral space, and so the land that is so contested, if I'm remembering and understanding it, is land that was the most productive and fertile for certain kinds of large-scale maize production, and that maize production, which was made possible by squeezing and squeezing and squeezing the Lesotho boundary, requires irrigation in some cases. So I wonder if you could say something too, that this isn't just any land, like that of all the land that the Kingdom of Lesotho has for arable, the arable land for crop production, these are quite significant, and flooding some of the lowlands seems to be just a remarkable sort of move for anyone to make.
Yeah, no, that's a subtext here for sure. If you've ever flown into Lesotho, the contrast is amazingly stark. You're flying over the Orange Free State primarily in South Africa, and if you look out the plane window, you could easily be forgiven for thinking you're flying over Iowa. Similar-sized fields, small-placed farmhouses, occasional towns connected by roads. And then as soon as the Caledon River comes into view and as the plane comes in low to land in Maseru, the difference is startling and stark, because Basotho villages are densely populated, very close together, surrounded by much smaller fields that are often plowed even today by oxen, some with tractors, some with oxen, but very small individually, held by small families. And yeah, it's really, if you look at the topo map here, the amount of land available for agricultural purpose in Lesotho is very small relative to the total amount of land in the country. Most of the mountains are too cold to reliably grow crops, because the freeze kills off a lot of the crops up there. And so those are really just left as grazing lands. So yeah, that's also it's a really good point, that this isn't just densely populated land, but it's the most fertile land that is there, and the conquered territories is seen as the most fertile land that was stolen. And so the fruits of South African farming are seen as being taken from stolen Basotho land. And so that's why there's still a lot of animosity along the border towards farms, and a lot of stock theft and back and forth petty crime today even.
One other thing just to add.
Microphone's coming.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you're doing this, is that history of sort of the economic development limitations for Lesotho is connected to the history of migration. So yeah, it's a complex of factors that are linked.
So I'm just wondering if it seems like, it makes me realize I don't know very much about how the actual process of independence happens, because it seems like once independence was granted in '66, that somehow would have had implications for reifying the borders as they were currently understood. Were there implications of that process at all, or the claims to the land on the other side it didn't affect them at all?
So it's, in terms of international law, right, and the OAU and things like this, right, and the sort of inviolability of borders that come with that, there's sort of a baking in of that process. But that said, the driving public sentiment that I'm talking about here saw independence as the time to finally be able to advocate for land return. Right, Basotho chiefs especially had been pushing the colonial state to advocate for the conquered territories for years, and that idea went nowhere. The British colonial administrators were not going to approach their South African counterparts about giving back land in the Free State. And so the hope was that with Basotho politicians in charge, and with the Basotho chieftaincy now not having to worry about the colonial administration, they could pressure the South African government in different ways. Was it a hope that the South African government was ever going to accede to or be pressured by? I don't, these are all hypotheticals, and I don't think that's terribly realistic in the apartheid era to think that it would have happened, but that isn't to say those hopes weren't real. There's a lot of negatives there. Those hopes were very real amongst people, that independence would lead to sovereignty, not just in getting the British administrators out, but in being able to advocate for themselves for issues that meant something to them. And one of those was the return of the conquered territories, because this map was seen as theft. And all the other, this isn't the only, this is just one map to illustrate this. There's a number of different lines that were drawn over the years that pushed Lesotho into its current boundaries from territory that various Basotho chiefs claimed in the 19th century. There's areas on the south side of Lesotho that some Basotho see as part of the conquered territories as well, around the town of Matatiele especially, and down in the Herschel district there at the bottom, the southwest corner there, those areas as well. So.
Thanks, John.
Oh, hi.
I want to take you back to the earlier part of your presentation. You did mention the opposition of the Basotho people that was to both the borders and the dam projects. But you didn't talk about whether there was any pretense on the part of the British to consult them, because along with Swaziland and Botswana land, that it was a supposedly unique sort of protectorate, High Commission trust territory, which meant that the people, our authorities, should have been consulted, even if it's under pretense. But were there any sort of attempts to pretend that they were consulting with the, since the
consulting about what?
Well, about the border, so that their voices would be heard, so the chiefs or the kings' voices would be heard.
Yes, there wasn't just the pretense of consultation. There was actual consultation, especially around the numerous times when South Africa formally requested the incorporation of the three territories, because baked into the 1909 Act of Union that creates South Africa is Clause 151, which says at some later date, these three territories will be incorporated, with the consultation of the people there. This is sort of the sword of Damocles hanging over Lesotho for the entire 20th century after that, right? Which is, we can just be thrown to the wolves. And it's right there in a treaty, and South Africa keeps requesting in 1924 and in 1932 and in a number of different times they send formal requests through. Each time they do, the British officials bring it before the National Council, and it's strongly, roundly, 100% rejected. But that said, that consultation is seen as a fig leaf, right? The chiefs are going to kick up a fuss every time it happens, but the chiefs and commoner Basotho all see the colonial officials meeting with their South African counterparts up in Pretoria without them. They don't know what sort of correspondence is going on, such as this secret correspondence in the 1940s between Smuts and the High Commissioner about inundating land in Lesotho that, as far as I can tell, has never been reported back to Lesotho. There would have been something in the National Council the instant that news hit, because that would have been seen as land alienation. So there was consultation, it was written into documents, and yet it was far from adequate because of the suspicion and mistrust. And a lot of the colonial officials, we call them British colonial officials, probably something like 75 to 80% of colonial officials actually came from South Africa. They were local staff hired into technical positions. The head, the resident commissioner, and the district commissioners all came from the UK. But most of the other white staff of the colonial regime were South Africans who came across the border to take up a civil service position. And so they were seen as particularly insidious too, right? Oh, look, the colonial regime is just bringing in white South Africans as a way of, you know, slowly creepingly taking us over. And they're not wrong, right? In the 1950s and 1960s, the officials who do the very, very controversial anti-soil erosion programs in Lesotho are coming straight from betterment projects in the Transkei that are seen as efforts to consolidate Africans and force them into the native reserves that they didn't want to be in. And so similar programs in Lesotho are seen as the exact same thing, because why wouldn't the same guy run the same program here as he did there? So yeah, these again are not suspicions without reasons. They're not irrational. They're completely rational, even if not always backed by evidence. Oh, hey.
Just last week, in the South African newspaper, there was an article asking, is it time for incorporation, Lesotho incorporation into South Africa? And I'm quite sure there's been this discourse since 1994. My question, I gather, is kind of two-pronged in that how does the history of Lesotho kind of inform that conversation? And two, when we look at the Basotho people's profile within the country and migration into South Africa, are there more Basotho people in South Africa today? And I'm quite sure there's been migration all the way up into Botswana as well. But how is that discourse occurring today as far as incorporation and thinking about independent Lesotho?
It's incredibly complicated. So I'll try to not spend an hour talking just on that. Yeah, so post-1994, the idea of incorporating Lesotho has come up more. It's still incredibly controversial, and even how you frame that is a political stance. So the way you just framed it was Lesotho's incorporation into South Africa. Many in Lesotho will say, why shouldn't South Africa incorporate into Lesotho? You know, why should we be part of that? You know, they certainly haven't figured out everything over there. The history of migration, of course, means that it's all complicated, right? Everyone has family on both sides of the border, and the question of you know, who is Basotho? Well, there's multiple Basothos, right? There's Basotho ba Lesotho, which are people from Lesotho, and then there's Basotho ba South Africa, right? So people who consider themselves Basotho but have South African citizenship for whatever reason, whether their families were stayed on the other side of the line when the lines were moving, or because they migrated there over time and took up citizenship and things like that, or because they, through whatever accident ended up there. There are more Sesotho speakers outside of Lesotho in South Africa than there are in Lesotho, and a decent percentage of the people with Lesotho citizenship live across the border. The South African Constitution has long allowed dual citizenship until either last year or 2018. The Lesotho Constitution did not. They're still finalizing how that's going to work out, but it's finally becoming legal to hold dual citizenship, which seems kind of crazy in some ways. But there's real investment in holding Lesotho as an independent place because things like land tenure are different, because people have rights to land that were there to be some sort of federation between the two. There's a worry that it would go away. So it also depends on how you're doing class-wise. Those who are doing well in Lesotho, some of them would actually lose some of that if the border were to go away, right? The U.S. Embassy in Maseru would no longer be there. A USAID program would no longer be there. It would all be based out of Pretoria. A lot of good, UN jobs would disappear. The number of foreign ministry people you would need in Maseru at that point drops by 90%. So the sort of people who are in power and are benefiting from the current situation are very loath to drop a border. There's a huge underclass of people who are definitely not benefiting from the border and are, sneaking into South Africa or, working hard to go through proper systems to get work permits in South Africa, who do not benefit from the system, who are hurt by it, right? Their wages are depressed, they have a hard time finding work, they're discriminated against, they can get thrown out of jobs, all the things we know about migrants who have trouble getting papers. So there's a strong population in Lesotho who would like to see some sort of open border regime. Where does this end up? I don't know. There is, currently a special dispensation work permit that about 200,000 Basotho have that allows people who were formerly unpapered to live and work freely in South Africa with formal papers. That said, it was a 4-year program and was just renewed for another 4. That's not an indefinite program. What happens at the end of those 4 years? You tell me what the shifting winds will bring in 4 years. So it's very complicated, but there are calls from within Lesotho for incorporation. There are calls from within Lesotho to stay Lesotho. There are calls for some sort of middle ground. The last Afrobarometer data I've seen, puts this around 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. It maps neatly along who has opportunities and who doesn't, and who, sees the need to go more so and who wants to stay. South Africa doesn't want another poor 11th province, but that said, they desperately need Lesotho's water and need a stable Lesotho. So, where does this put people? In a very odd and awkward marriage that they can't get out of. But it does speak to the relevance of this project and the need to trace the ebbs and flows over time and be more real about, where a lot of these people came from and why. So.
No more comments or questions? Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you all
See
for
you
coming
next
out today.
Thursday.